Hi everyone, I'm Kritisha and welcome to Dhikichyau the podcast. This is episode 46 and this is also a part of the mental health series that we've been doing. And with us today we have Prathama Raghavan. Welcome to Dhikichyau the podcast.
Thank you, Kritisha. Lovely to be here.
So before we start, a little bit of introduction on Prathama. She is a development psychologist. She works as a mental health and disability support worker in Kathmandu. She uses narrative approaches and is a consultant, teacher, and supervisor of narrative practices. And she has over 15 years of experiences, and she's formerly worked as mental health and inclusion and access support coordinator for high school students and in humanitarian context in post-conflict and disaster situations. She did her master's and PhD in developmental psychology from Université Paul-Valéry, Montpellier. Did I do that right? Montpellier, France. And master's in psychology from Osmania University, Hyderabad, India. Whew. That was a very long introduction, and we're really glad to have you as a part of this series. Welcome once again.
Thank you so much. Yeah, a bit strange hearing all that about myself, but
but that's like a lot of things that you've collected over the years. So yeah. I think this is something we also talked about before the podcast, how the tables have turned here, because you're the one who's like interviewing people on mental health and issues relating to the same. So how do you feel? I mean, because I would want to continue and ask you about your story, you know?
Yeah.
So would you want to tell us your story, why you are the way you are, and why you are here?
I mean, I don't like how it started. You mean?
How it started. Like for you, how did you start your journey with psychology?
Yeah.
When was it that you were like, okay, this is something I would want to pursue?
Yeah. I think I had this idea that I wanted to be in some sort of helping profession, you know, and I considered many of them, mostly the medical field, I guess, because it's what you get most exposure to, and you know, it's. I grew up in the south of India in Hyderabad for the most part, and definitely this whole doctor-engineer thing was an influence, right? So if I had to choose one, then I would have chosen more the medical-related professions. I considered nurse, things like that, like whatever was, I think, what I knew about that existed around me that were helping professions. But I had never seen or heard of a psychologist or a counselor, you know, when I was starting out choosing.
Growing up.
Yeah. But I used to take, when I was going to, doing my 11th and 12th, I used to take the bus from this bus stop where there was a special school. It was one of the biggest special schools of the city, right? And so there would be kids who were a special school, meaning it's for children with disabilities.
Right.
And so there would be like children with disabilities coming. It was also a deaf school, so there would be kids and talking in sign, and you know, and at that age, I was between 16 and 18. It's you know, I mean, it was interesting to be there every day and watch these kids come into school while I was waiting for the bus, you know.
Right.
And I think, and that summer after I finished my 11th and 12th, I volunteered in that institute so before I chose what I wanted to do in undergrad. And I think partly was that it opened me to so many different professions, right? Like because there were special educators, there were therapists of different sorts, and there were psychologists, though I don't remember meeting anybody. But, you know, it just seemed like, okay, this is a thing you can do with your life, like work with children who have special needs, children with disabilities. I think that's kind of how it started. And then it was basically looking at like courses and thinking, okay, what can I do? And psychology seemed like that could be the path to, you know, working with children with special needs, basically.
Right.
Because medical school, very quickly I realized I don't think I have the the stamina that it takes, right?
Right.
So
it's very hard.
Yeah, it's such hard work and such commitment. And I mean, so is this, I guess you realize later, but that the kind of, competition and all that, the way that the medical school is.
Requires, yeah.
Yeah. So
did you explore
that's,
other areas though? Maybe, I don't know, IT or literature or business or all of that, apart from this?
I did. I mean, so in the kind of program that I did in undergrad, you had to choose 3 subjects as your major, kind of, right? Like, so I actually chose psychology, and I love literature. I mean, I read a lot as a kid, and I loved books anyway. So I chose psychology, literature, and strangely enough, and mostly I think because I thought it would be socially more acceptable, I chose computer applications.
Wow.
It was like a strange combination, but yeah, so that's what I studied, and I really enjoyed also the computer applications
You
part,
did?
the programming
Okay.
and stuff. Yeah, actually, yes.
But then you knew that you wanted to pursue psychology.
Yeah. But like some of my friends one of my friends went on to pursue like cognitive psychology, which was, and like more human computer interaction type thing, right? Like, so that was also both psychology as well as computer applications that came together, which were things that became possible. We didn't know it existed when we started studying.
Wait, so
I
what
guess.
is the difference, just to clear things out?
No, I think
What
there
you
are
pursued in,
people, for
yeah.
example, who study human development or human psychology,
Right.
but also think about it more in the context of technology and an interaction of technology and human beings, right?
Okay,
Like,
okay.
so for example, how do you make certain technologies accessible to the diversity of human brain functioning or neurological functioning or sensorial functioning, right? Like, so thinking about things like that, like how do you make a website accessible to
Right,
someone who
right.
is blind, videos accessible to people who are deaf, like stuff like that,
Okay.
Yeah.
So you were, so just to do a quick recap, you were always into, helping others and all of that. And then you were kind of pursuing science in a way.
I was, yeah.
Yeah. And then how did that transition from science to psychology? When was it that you wanted to pursue psychology, developmental psychology?
I think it was pretty like
Clear to you?
impulsive.
Oh, okay.
In the sense that I actually thought I would do a science course, and I went and I looked up courses and all that, right? And then I saw psychology and I basically signed up for it.
Okay.
Because I don't think there was, I mean, really, I don't think I had heard the possibility of studying psychology before I saw it on the course list, So yeah, I think that's how it happened, which is so different from now, I guess, right? Like, I don't know, yeah. So for most people, maybe. But
Right. Makes sense. So over the course of time, from when you were as a high schooler standing in that bus stand and, looking at kids with disability, and now you're a professional therapist, I mean, what is the difference? How has the definition of mental health changed for you?
I mean, I don't know if I would have been able to articulate what I thought was mental health even then, right? Like, it was more like, I think, looking at someone doing a job and thinking, oh, this feels like something I would like to do, which is why I feel like that representation was important. I don't think I would have thought about it if I'd not seen someone working with children or hadn't seen that special school.
So you had a role model growing up?
I think the role models I had, the things that I wanted to do was so totally, completely different.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay.
Very different. And very like fantasy role models I had.
Okay.
So, but also in that sort of helping role, okay? Like these 2 shows that I used to love. I don't even know if you'll know them, but one was the X-Files, which is like these 2 people like catching aliens or whatever, or investigating extraterrestrial appearances on Earth. And one of them was like a man and a woman, and the woman I really liked,
Okay.
and the other was Buffy, the vampire slayer.
Okay.
Who is like, and I love these women. It's also that at that time, I think on TV, you didn't have a lot of representation of,
Right, true.
Women doing all kinds of diverse things was not really accessible, I feel. So yeah, but then I think there is that aspect of helping society somehow in
Right,
both,
right,
right? Like,
right.
so I'd like to think I stayed in the theme, but who knows?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. Because for me, mental health, whenever I think of mental health and whenever I'm
Yeah.
like trying to have a conversation with someone about mental health, there's this one example I always go to. Okay?
Mm.
So, like, just like picturing someone who has a broken arm, right?
Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah.
that's something that's physically visible.
Yeah.
And you
Yeah.
can sort of sympathize and empathize with that person, and you
Mm.
can, maybe like ask them if they're like okay, or if you can do something for them. But mental health is something that is not visible at all,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that is something you don't. I mean, you can't read people's mind,
Yeah.
so you never know what's going on in their head. So I think
Mm.
that example is always there for me. Like
Yeah.
makes me understand the at least some of the bits of mental health. So
Yeah.
that is how that is also why I try to empathize a lot with people and not just like make assumptions. And that is
Yeah.
also the reason why we're like trying to um, take one step at destigmatizing mental health, and
Yeah.
that is
Yeah.
exactly what we wanted to talk to you about. So
Mm.
if you had to explain it to someone,
Yeah.
what is mental health and
Mm.
how is it different from mental illnesses?
Yeah. Um, I think what you said about mental health, first of all, is important, right? Like the fact that there are ways in which, for people, those of us who do this
Right.
work, have
Mm.
ways of saying, okay, someone is experiencing difficulty or
Right.
distress, right? Like, but it is hard. It's not always obvious, no.
Mm.
You can't see it. So I think that's an important thing to remember
Mm.
always. I think if I had to explain mental health, I would actually think it's pretty similar to what we would do for what we consider physical health, right? Like
Right.
without thinking about the indicators of physical health, meaning no blood tests,
Mm.
not those things, but what would I consider well-being?
Mm.
It's that if I with the relationship with my physical body allows me to do things in my life that I want to do,
Mm.
right? That it helps me to have a relationship with my environment, with people I care about,
Right.
in a way that I would like to,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And mental health is also like that. It's to be able to be in a state where I can have a relationship with the things that I want to do, the things people I want to have relationships with,
Mm.
in ways that I would like to have that relationship, right? Like, and what I mean by that is that sometimes, sometimes when we are in a lot of distress or going through uh, something really
Mm.
difficult, right? Then the ways in which the kind of relationship we might have to our interests, to things we like to do, they
Mm.
change, no? We might not feel like we want to do them as much, or the motivation to do them kind of reduces.
Right.
And then we think, okay, not being motivated is a um, condition for like not being mentally well, right?
Mm.
You could think that, but it's actually that everybody would like to be in a relationship with their work and
Right.
people around them where they feel well and happy. And I mean, happy not in the la la, I'm like, laughing all the time kind of way, but okay,
Yeah.
basically, right? Like, um, so, but I think also that in the current state of the world,
Mm.
the way in which, I mean, not only what's happening internationally, politically, locally, politically, or the kinds of like conflicts, disasters, things that happen, and how
Mm.
that influences our lives, and also the kind of systems of power, for example, gender, the like normative ideas of sexuality, for example, even the ideas we have about who is an able person, right? Like
Right.
all of these ideas also influence mental health, and they make some people feel like they are not good enough, right? Like, so it's, to me, it's really not also an individual thing, right? Like
Mm.
most, when you think about it, um, most people who experience mental health conditions, when you're talking to them, there is always something like this that is influencing it, right? Like,
For something from the environment, you mean?
yeah,
Society.
some of these social have tos or how we should be, or those kinds of things do influence.
Right.
So I also wonder what is possible in terms of what can we call mental health when these are always around us.
Right.
Then it is us navigating it in a way that feels okay with us, right? Like, and it doesn't feel oppressive every day. I don't know if that's a definition, but I do see it a bit like that.
So it has changed from mental health being just personal and individualistic to something that's broader, that's around the society.
Yeah.
Right, got it. Makes sense. I think this is something we can also connect with what you've been doing right now. So do you want to touch upon a little bit about what you studied, developmental psychology, right?
Yeah.
So can we talk about that a little bit? Because I don't think I understand it very well. So what is development psychology?
It is actually now a little bit hard for me to explain also, because so many years after since I went to university to do that. But
no, I'm not like literally asking for the definition.
Basically what it does is that you think about human life in like kind of stages of development, or in different ways in which different ages, or how we look through the lifespan, right? Like, it used to also be called lifespan psychology, for example. Or so it is looking at human life through our human lifespan. So all these events that are part of a human life, what are the ways in which different people respond to those events of our lives? Like, I mean, of course, being born, but like also other, the first day of school, or things that, making friends, like falling in love. So things that may be part of our human life, being interested, having hobbies, all of these things. How does that? What are some ways in which we integrate that into our life? Like, what meaning do we make out of it? There are all kinds of theories around all of these things that we study, different theories of people. And there are also theories about stages of development, which can be development of all the different, like cognitive development, development of language, development of social skills, development of emotional responses, or just emotional development, right? Like, so all of these things, and there are different theories that explain all of these developments that happen through a lifespan. And that's kind of what we study, right? And in that, and basically when you study that, what you're trying to understand is, in some ways, the widest possible way of understanding human life, and the development of human beings from a baby to the end of life, right? Like, all the different theories that could explain why this happens, why do kids do this or do that, or how does a child develop from the first word to the first sentence, like what cognitive processes are involved for that to happen, how does a child learn language, like that kind of stuff. So there is also the cognitive aspects of it, like language learning, learning a particular skill like counting, or how you learn them. You learn them from imitation, or you learn them by doing yourself. You learn them by creatively exploring your environment. Yeah. So, it's kind of theories that explain all of these things in many different ways, actually. And I think many people who study developmental psychology, or at least my peers, like, mostly it used to be called like child adolescent psychology also. So many people work with children and young people, but there are also people who work with older people, for example, because that developmental psychologists also sometimes specialize or work particularly with people who are either just old age, right? Like, and the very particular things that they might be thinking about, or the experiences they might have, or the difficulties they might have, the questions they might ask themselves in that particular age group. There are people who also do that in particular. I kind of chose children,
Okay.
young people,
Is
and
there something
families.
similar for like when it's a child and when it's like old people? Because
Meaning, the not real. No. You mean in terms of a developmental stage?
yeah.
No. I think it's very different.
Okay.
You know, the
No, because once old age hits, you kind of become a little bit childish. I don't know. I'm just like thinking out loud. I don't know. You can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm just like assuming.
I mean, I think there is. It's a. It's a. I mean, I guess a stage of development um, where you've lived a whole life, right? Like, but it's a child has not lived a whole life, and yes, there may be some, as you get older and older, there may be some loss of certain kinds of skills that you had before, right? Like, and that is part of like the human cycle of getting older. Also, that there will be loss of some skills, and so but otherwise, I don't know. I don't think there's any similarity in that sense. Like, yeah, uh, but that can be an emotionally really difficult thing to lose skills, right? Like, and you be aware of losing skills. That's hard. So I think it's very different because children are learning skills. It's a different kind of sense of self, Yeah.
Okay. So you chose to go with the children
Yeah.
part?
I think because of that special school thing. And I really like children.
Okay.
Maybe because I'm the oldest of
Oh, you're
three
the
also.
oldest.
I took care of my little sisters.
Oh, okay. Okay, that's nice. Just one question I wanted to ask. Is it true that therapists have to go to therapy? Like once you start taking like therapy, you have to take therapy as a therapist?
I mean, not have to, like,
But it's advised.
I wouldn't even say that. I think it's our journeys with whether we see a therapist or not is our own journey, even for a therapist. I don't think that I would say that they have to see therapists or it is advised that they see therapists. I think what is important is, but that's important for all of us, is to have a support system that supports us, um, so we can be able to show up in the work that we do in the way that we want to, right? Like,
Right.
in the best possible way, right? Like, and we do have, for example, this. I guess one of the ways of getting that sort of support from someone who does work like you is also, it's called supervision, and it's like kind of it's a way of consulting with another therapist and asking support for something that you might be finding difficult in the conversations that you are having with your clients, or something that you're finding difficult in your relationship with being a therapist, right? Like, so things like that you can discuss with what we call a supervisor,
Okay.
and that I find is very important. And it can be also, I'm part of a few peer supervision groups, so we are groups of people that who work with in a similar context, for example, or work with children or something like that, and we talk about different approaches together. We can talk about some things that may be difficult, right? Like, again, asking each other for ideas and suggestions, and all of this is done with the confidentiality and all of that,
Right.
taken into account, right? Like, never in these situations will you give any identifying characteristics or names, definitely not, but
Yeah.
not even identifying characteristics or things like that, right? Like, um I'm very careful about all of that, like, and then we could, so I when I start a new conversation or a new relationship with someone who wants to consult with me, I have a list of like things about confidentiality, and I all in that
That
I
you discuss
also,
with your
yeah,
client?
but I also give it to them, like, so they can
Okay.
have it, and in that I also write this thing that may consult someone for supervision,
Yeah.
but like the confidentiality stuff will be,
Mm,
respected, taken into account, and because I think that's so important. Part
right.
of what makes the relationship therapeutic is also the fact that it's an environment that is,
Someone you can trust.
yeah, that trust relationship, right? Like that's so important. So I think, yeah.
Yeah. Because, no, I mean, I personally go to therapy myself, and
Yeah.
I kind of had that conversation.
Yeah.
And I think my therapist sort of told me, I think he meant the supervisor then,
Oh, okay.
because he
Yeah.
kind of told me that he was consulting someone.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
he also has to go to therapy and stuff like that. So I just wanted to
Yeah. Yeah.
clear that out.
Yeah, I mean, but it's if you I really appreciate the having a therapy space for myself too as a client,
Okay.
right? Like I do, because I like thinking, I like having that space to think about, um, this thing of how can I be a better human, basically,
Right,
right? Like,
right.
and the distresses and difficulties that I'm experiencing, how do I
Mm,
not let it do harm in the world.
mm.
So, and I love I've also been in therapy, had therapy for many years. I love it.
So it's like
So
a thing for you to keep bettering yourself.
in some ways, I mean, also to talk about, things that the difficulties in my life. I mean, I have them
Yeah,
too, right? Like,
yeah.
but also to think about, okay, for example, I'm having a week where there is a lot of anxiety because there's lots of
Mm,
things or whatever, something, right? But I don't want that to have an effect on people I'm interacting with,
right.
or I want it to have less effect, right? Like
Mm.
I care about that. So I think I talk about that too quite a bit,
Mm.
but also about how to manage the anxiety when you have like thousand things to do.
Yeah, no,
Yeah,
I mean, I asked that because I kind of got into this loop in my therapy session where I was constantly looking at things that I can improve.
yeah, yeah,
So I was like, I mean, I started like identifying my, you know, the very first step for me was to acknowledge the fact that I have feelings and I'm allowed to feel that,
yeah,
because I was very avoidant initially.
yeah.
And after that, I started like noticing every emotion. It was like, I don't know, it was like I found something new, because I wasn't very used to feeling things. And after some time, I just started finding flaws in myself, or like things that I have to fix. So that became one loop that
Mm.
I was like, viciously going after. So I was just like asking if that's how you see therapy for yourself.
Oh no. I mean, I think maybe sometimes yes, and I mean, it's not. I don't want to see it like that, right? Like, and I don't want people to see it like that
Mm.
either. I mean, but I think, um, see, to be, I think that when you have any kind of experience of being marginalized, or your experience of life is not in total complete alignment with the way in which mainstream society would like it to be,
Mm.
you will experience distress, right?
Right.
Like that happens, and so to me, um, it doesn't mean that people need to be fixed, because what would that mean? Does that mean we must all be like follow what mainstream society,
Conform to the
yeah,
society, right?
it doesn't, right? So that is not the kind of fixing,
Mm.
or even the kind of bettering ourselves that we're talking about, right?
Right.
Like we're talking more about living in alignment with things that are important to me, that kind of
Mm.
bettering or whatever, like so I can feel like I'm living in alignment with the values that are important to me.
Right.
For example, you were talking about empathy earlier, and
Mm.
wanting to have that empathy for
Mm.
people, because you don't know what's going on in their mind, or what their experience is, or what their
Mm.
day was like, or any of that, right? Like for me also that's important: empathy, compassion,
Mm.
kindness. But I also have to be careful to not let that again this idea of I want to be a kind person or whatever oppress me, right? Like that's
Putting
not
your
good.
need across, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's also not good. But but I would like to be more and more in alignment with these things that are important to me. So in that way, I mean.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of things that you just said. Like, there is one thing about how you don't need to conform to the society
Yeah.
and call it being mentally well.
Yeah.
And the
Definitely.
other was, like having your values and being aligned to them,
Yeah.
but at the same time not being oppressed
Yeah.
just because that means it aligns with your values. So can we like a little bit unpack that, because I think that's very heavy, and just for the benefit of our listeners and our viewers, maybe we can touch upon that, because I think that is something, like, to me it took a lot of time to understand that, so I just like want to make sure that our viewers and listeners understand that too. So can we start with the conforming to the society bit? Like, I mean, I think that aligns with what you are practicing right now, narrative practices.
That's right.
So can we touch upon that a little bit?
So do you have any specific questions about it, or do you want me to speak?
I think we can start with the principles of narrative practices, because I think that will give a better idea of what it is and why you guys are following that.
Yeah. So maybe not go into like all the, or like what, not about the I'm not going to list the principles of narrative practices, right? Like, but to say this idea, right? Like, it comes from the fact that, I mean, there are a couple of ideas of the narrative practices that influence or inform that, right? Like, one is this thing that we say people are experts of their own lives, including very young people, right? Like, meaning children and young people, everyone are experts of their own lives, meaning that I am navigating my life every day, and the difficulties in my life too. And I have some skills and some expertise in navigating that particular life, right? Like, so for example, if I'm navigating a life where I experience that anxiety is around me a lot, then I am also developing and learning and have learned skills to push that anxiety away a little bit more, or it's here hovering around me, but I'm still doing this podcast. Just as a
Nice
joke.
example.
I'm not really. But that, right? Like, we do manage to do things even when.
Do you mean that those are the coping mechanisms?
I guess that is a word that that we use, right? Like, but then with coping mechanisms, sometimes there is this idea that some of them are good, some of them are bad.
Right.
No? But in the narrative approaches, not to say that all of them are good, but it's not about good or bad. It's that there is a certain expertise to navigate it. And if I think and if I can stand in the place of that expertise, right? Like, if I think, okay, I'm doing this because I want anxiety to be a little bit more far away. I'm doing this because it is a way, because to me, protecting myself is important.
At that moment, okay.
Yeah. If you're, thinking about, or if you're saying, I'm doing this because I want to feel better, and even if that coping mechanism is considered
quote unquote bad.
Exactly. But it is helping you to feel better. It's helping you to protect yourself. And that part is more important than what that coping mechanism or that skill is. Right? So if you think about, okay, why is protecting yourself important? And if we talk about that a little bit more, perhaps we discover so many other ways in which they also protect themselves, or they also, try to keep anxiety away, that may be ones that they might want to choose more. For example, for example, I go to take a shower, right? Like, if I'm feeling very uneasy, and I one of them can be, I don't know what examples to use that would be, but let's say that going to take a shower is something that would be considered a good coping mechanism, right? Like, and now if we put many many ways in which they respond to this, in that they have, then if you list them all, or then they can kind of choose which ones they want, and have and understand that, oh, I use all of these things. So sometimes maybe I want to choose the shower more. Maybe I want to choose the dribbling the ball more than, say, for example, choosing to scroll on social media.
Right. Okay.
Right? Like, so like that. So that there is more agency to make that choice, because it has been, because we've spoken about it, it's been kind of, it's presented in front of you. It's just becoming more visible. That's the word I was looking for, right? Like the ways in which you respond is becoming more visible. And when it becomes more visible and you're standing in the place of, oh, I do these things because I want to take care of myself, then from that place, I have more agency to choose what is that would support me in taking care of myself. You know?
So are you suggesting we should have like multiple coping mechanisms to choose from?
So what I'm saying is that this is how we would explore a conversation in, if someone was talking about some kind of distress that they're experiencing, then we would try to understand all the ways in which they respond to that distress.
Right. But the reason why some of the coping mechanisms are called quote unquote bad is because it becomes an addiction, right? So for example, one of the coping mechanism could be alcohol or, you know, smoking. So, okay, yeah, I mean, like you said, it could be helpful for that moment, but, you know, incorporating that habit can be a toxic one in the long run, right? So how do you navigate that?
I think what I'm trying to say is also the qualification of that activity as toxic or as bad,
Healthy,
right? Like, I'm not saying that we wait, let me think about this a little bit, okay, so that I can articulate.
Sure.
A little bit complex territory we are in.
That's fine.
So I think the idea is to not demonize something that has, it at least started off being something that was to take care of myself or to help me feel better, right? Like, so if I can think about the fact that, oh, I started it off because it helped me to feel better, if I can have some compassion for
for yourself,
for myself that chose that, instead of thinking about it as this horrible thing that I do,
right,
you know,
right.
because then that is more supportive of me choosing other ways of, you know, over me thinking this is this horrible thing that I do, right? Like that is, so you know what I mean? I mean, does this make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
So in that, I think it allows for that sort of compassion. Yeah, if you think about it, that
to have more agency over your habits.
exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that makes more sense because, like you said, when we demonize such activities, we tend to forget that we did that for a reason.
Yeah.
And when we, you know, have that idea in our head, we're more able to change that narrative in a way.
Yeah.
And put action in the same thing. So yeah. Makes sense.
Mm.
I think we're talking about coping mechanism. What were we talking about before the coping mechanism? We were on to
I guess narrative practices.
yes, narrative practices. Yeah. So I think that does give a little bit of example on you know, having agency over your own story.
Yeah.
And how does that, I think that is still on an individual level, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So how do we connect that with the society?
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good question, right? Like, so the idea then with the another idea of the narrative approaches is this idea that we are made up of stories, right? Like, and there are some stories that are influenced by the what we call the dominant discourses of the world or the systems of power, meaning patriarchy, heteronormativity, ideas of like ableism, I call it, ideas of certain kinds of able body and able mind, or whatever that ideas of that ableism, and other systems of power too that are particular to South Asia. For example, caste, class, where you come from, like where you come from in the sense region, in terms of what you had access to. So many, all of these things influence like our relationship with ourselves, our relationship with others, our relationship with what things we like to do, our relationship with our bodies, our relationship with the world at large, or my place in the world, right? Like, and when all this happens, when the world tells you that some people can have access to this, and some people, and you cannot, or and that is so obvious in the world in so many ways for so many people who are marginalized, right? Like, when that does happen, how can we put that the whole onus of mental well-being on an individual, right? Like, when the idea of not fitting in to the dominant ideas of being human are so oppressive, and that not fitting in is what brings the distress. But not fitting in or resisting it, right? Like, if I'm not fitting in, I'm also resisting it somehow, right? Like, I'm doing my own, I am choosing an alternative story, or which is my preferred way of being. And in that, I'm resisting the dominant ideas of, what I...
The more mainstream concept and ideas that's there in society.
The reason we call it dominant is because it's that it actually dominates, right? Like, it says everyone should be this way, everyone should act in this way, or stuff like that, right? Like, that if you deviate from it, there is a certain effect of that. If you choose something that's slightly different in your life, there is an effect, there is a consequence.
Usually negative effect, right?
Yes, right. And so that all this can cause distress, right? Like, and there is no way to separate this, which happens all around us every day. From the day we are born, we are assigned sex at birth, right? Like, from those moments till how we are socialized, we are not socialized the same depending on what sex we are, what gender we are assigned at birth, right? So when you consider all that, how can we think of mental health as an individual thing at all? So oh, okay. Okay, did that make sense?
Yeah, it does. But I'm still trying to, because the example that you gave me last time still stands out for me, because you kind of said that if I am a queer person, and if I choose to be something that the society does not accept, then that isn't exactly my fault, but it's like the society's fault of not being able to accept me.
Absolutely.
So that is why mental health becomes a systemic thing and not just an individualistic thing, right? I mean, like, that was a very eye-opening thing for me, because I never saw it through that lens. So that was interesting. So when you interact with your clients, does this like come up very often? I mean, are they able to see this, or what are the biases that come in while you try to explain this?
I think it's because my stance is that the systems of power in the world influence or tell us that some ways of being are okay or not okay, right? Like, and because that is my stance when I'm doing the work that I'm doing, I think the ways in which I ask questions, or it's a little bit hard to give examples right now, I can't think of, but the ways in which I ask questions I try to make them think about it. I won't say, sometimes I might say it, But like I think of this question. So one of the founders of narrative practices is this person called Michael White. And in one of his interviews, I always remember this. There's a question where he asks this woman who's consulting with him, is it more likely that mothers feel this way, or is it more likely that fathers feel this way about certain responsibility for their child? Something around that it is, or responsibility about caregiving, in the duties in the house, some around that the conversation's happening. And he asks her, will mothers are more likely to feel this way? And I think she's talking about not feeling like being good enough, or experiencing guilt for something, right? Like, and I remember that question quite a bit. Like, I might not ask that same question, but I do steal some of those questions because they're so precious. I mean, and so that tells the person will know that, oh, yes,
it's different for someone else.
Yeah, it's different for the father, right? Like, this caregiving thing is, mothers are more likely to feel it. So you realize it's not only you, but it's something that is, so that's a very small and subtle way of starting that conversation. But I think what is actually most important is that we be aware of, as therapists, being aware of those discourses being there in the room, that these discourses demand different things of people who are assigned women at birth, versus those who are assigned male at birth, right? And also thinking all of the discourses, I mean, thinking about also what is that masculinity discourse, right? Like, how does it sort of recruit men to conform to that masculinity discourse, right? That also we have to be aware of, because that is also not individualistic.
All right. Wait, so you mean why men are being taught how to be masculine and all of that?
Yeah, like what
are we sort of entering the toxic masculinity domain now? I mean,
kind of
are you referring to that?
masculinity? What are the demands of masculinity that men have to conform to also, right? Like, and what happens if they deviate or they choose another way from the demands of masculinity,
right?
Or toxic masculinity, I mean, if you want to call it that. But yeah, so I think it is always having this awareness of the systems of power that recruit people into behaving in particular ways, and that have or give out in some ways consequences for not behaving in particular ways, right? Like,
right.
And one of those consequences is, I mean, we can also think about the distress we experience as a consequence of not
conforming to those notions,
to the dominant discourse. But that not to say that in order for the distress to go, we have to conform, right? I mean, just to clarify that.
Right. So you're saying men, women, whoever there is in the society, you sort of have like certain rules and regulations that you have to, the unsaid rules that's always there in the society, for men, for women, for queer people. Everyone has, for queer people, I mean, I'm not sure if there...
there could be, within, in micro communities, there can also be ways of being that are,
but you don't like, if you deviate from the rules and responsibilities that's there for you, that's set for you, you will feel some kind of constraint or like resistance, and that is what mostly causes anxiety or to some extent depression as well. But what you're clarifying is just because you conform doesn't mean that that's how you cope with the anxiety and depression, right?
Yeah, exactly. And also to what the other like key idea of the narrative practices that I want to bring in here is that people are always responding to the problems in their lives, right? Like
some way or the other.
Yeah, some way or the other. And in some ways, the distress that we may experience in our bodies is also a response telling us something is not okay, right? So so in our understanding of all this, if we can bring all this into our understanding, how might it influence the distress that I experience?
Mm.
How might it influence um, that that anxiety or that thing that we call depression, right? Like, so this is one way. I mean, then we were talking earlier about how to think about the ways in which I'm already responding, but all of this is in the process for us to in conversation discover or uncover parts of ourselves that are our preferred ways of being. It's that's that preferred is the language that we use in the narrative approaches, which is to say it's my preference to be this way, right? Like, and I can, and that preferred way of being, which is again, like I was saying earlier, in alignment with things that are important to me. They are informed by, say, a value or a principle or things that are important to me, and those preferred ways of being, if I can, I mean, the point of our conversations, or one of the things we want to do in our conversations, is to make that preferred ways of being richer and richer and richer, right? So I can have more and more access to these preferred ways of being in my life.
So that also connects us with the values that we have, I think. Do values derive those preferred ways of being?
Yeah, or the other way around. I might have a preferred way of being, and from that I can
derive my values.
Yeah, right. Like they are connected, and in talking about my preferred ways of being, and connecting them to my values, and connecting it to other people who also may have those values, from whom I might have learned those preferred ways of being.
Right.
People, beings, okay, like it can be characters from TV shows, or from books, it can be animals. We can take some of these preferred ways of being from all the beings around us, right? Like not only humans, but so when you connect all of those things, then my preferred ways of being can become richer and richer,
Right. I think I am a little well acquainted with the idea of values, because this again goes back to my journey with therapy, because it was when I was, just chasing one goal after the other. And once you reach a goal, and then you're looking for something new, and then you're looking for something more exciting, more stimulating, and all of that. So I just reached a point where I was just fed up of chasing. And that is when I had this conversation with my therapist, and he sort of introduced me the idea of living your life with goals and living your life with values, and how living your life with values is more fulfilling, because there's not a set goal that you have to reach, but it's like living and being, but being aligned with your own values. So, I mean, I've had my share of understanding what values is, but I just wanted you to help our listeners and viewers understand the ideas of, values and why it's important. What are the benefits, or what it helps you get rid of, in a way?
I feel like I should start with another of the narrative ideas, which is that people are meaning makers. Right?
Meaning makers.
Yeah. And meaning making is the process through which we might ascribe value to things that we do or things that are important to us, right? Like, because it's not the same for different people, right? Like, so that meaning making process is how you also come to this, that what values are important to me and what is important to me in general, right? Like, so to think about the ways in which we may navigate life, or decide or prefer some things over others, as ways in which we might make meaning out of relationships, out of even activities that we do, hobbies that we like, right? Like, so I mean, that I just want to say that, like, that's where you begin to start thinking about but I think a really I guess question that we could think about is, for example, if I'm example should we take? For example, if I were to ask you, this doing podcasts and doing interviews, right? Like, um, why is that important for you? What are you giving value to in doing that, right? Like, what would your answer be?
For me, this is like exploring and feeding my curiosity in a way.
Yeah.
And I mean, we do put in a lot of effort in finding the answers to our questions.
Yeah.
And if in doing so, like we can share it with someone, and if it helps them, then that's like an added bonus, you know.
Yeah.
So it's like a hobby, and it's also therapeutic in many ways. So it's also feeding our curiosity,
Yeah.
at least for me.
Yeah. So many things you said, right? Like exploring and feeding curiosity, answering some questions that you put a lot of effort into, and so sharing it with other people. Maybe it'll help others to also being therapeutic for yourself. And in this, there are, like that feeding curiosity could be something that's a value, right? Like wanting to help others could be something that is a value or a principle, or something that you're standing for, something that's important for you.
Wait, what's the difference, value and principle?
Oh my God, let's not go there.
No, because I sort of like I kind of refer to the principles of narrative practices, and you're like, oh my God, there's like a list.
No, I just didn't want to. I mean, here when I said principles, I mean principles that could govern my life.
Okay.
Right, like that all beings are equal, or
okay, yeah. Let's just stick to values.
Yeah, it's sometimes because that distinct. Anyway, it's
Okay.
difficult to adequately explain.
Okay, got it. So values.
Yeah. So, like some of that, like the curiosity and the helping others, those are some values, right? Like, so sometimes it can take a very few questions to get to the values, and we can ask ourselves those questions too, to think about what is important to me in the work that I do. Like, why did I choose that work? Or why is it important to me to have plants in my house? Why is it important for me to play with my child, right? Like, why is it important for me to have one-on-one time with my friend? So, when you ask that question, then you know why it's important, and we can, and that helps us to make meaning out of that thing, which to us seems like something that we randomly chose, right? Like, I randomly chose to start doing podcasts. It can seem like that if we don't inquire into it and ask and make that meaning out of it, right? Like, so, I mean, I'm not saying that it, maybe the podcast thing, I mean, not that it for you it was like that, but people can often say that, no? That, oh, I just happened. I just started doing it. And so when you inquire into it, then you see that you can make meaning out of it, or you find these things that, oh, it's because, and I make podcasts, but I also do this thing that is also because of this value of curiosity for me. Oh, I also do this thing which is also because of this value of helping others for me, right? Like, you discover other things that you do that also maybe show that this value is important for you in your life, right? And the other thing I want to say about, because we are talking so much about values and preferred ways of being and all that, I mean, I think another important thing that I like about the narrative approaches is also that no identity is fixed, right? And that's also this thing of being multi-storied. There are many stories in me, in you, in everyone, and that none of that is fixed. It's not. It's that we are exploring these territories, and the narratives also uses this metaphor of territories and landscapes, right? So I'm exploring these territories, and right now I'm in this territory. I have explored the plants, the herbs, the microorganisms here, right? And then I might go there and I might explore something else in the territory of my own life, of my own way of making meaning, of my own preferred ways of being. There are unexplored territories in my own life, right? Like, and I might go there and I might discover something new about myself, and I might feel differently about something, so which is all part of being human. And I feel that this way of looking at ourselves as stories, and like we are exploring territories, and in different territories there are different stories of our lives, which we can make different meaning out of. And then it's also depending on somehow on time, right? Like, so at this time I make this meaning out of these stories. At another time I might make different meaning out of those stories.
Different time of my life.
Different time of your life, right? Like, so and all of that is okay. It's also not to fix identity in, you said curiosity was important, so it has to be important for life,
Values can change.
Things that are important can change, and they can become more or less important depending on situations. And
So why do you think living with values is important?
I don't know if I can answer that question.
No, I was just thinking because most often we're not introduced to this idea at all. Because most often we're just like doing things because, like we said earlier, there are like set of rules that we have to follow, and we just follow that. So isn't like living with value getting out of that rat race in a way?
I suppose that's one way to think about it. And I mean, it's making me think more about this some spiritual traditions that maybe think about it in that way, right? Like,
As in?
Like maybe, for example, the whole idea of being in the moment, being here in the present, of Buddhist mindfulness practices, no? I mean, I don't know much about all of it. Like, I read because I'm interested and because it helps me in my own life. But, nothing, I don't know anything in, no sense of expertise or anything should be associated with this, right? But when you ask that question, it makes me think of some of these practices that talk about being more present to what choices we are making and what decisions we are making, basically, right? Like, and not being that those actions, our actions, are not dictated by the dominant systems of the world.
Being more conscious.
Yeah, that is what it's getting me thinking about. And I think with the kind of questions and the interviews that we might do with narrative practices, we are trying to make more visible that agency that we have in making choices and decisions in our lives, that we already exercise to some extent, but we might not fully acknowledge. And in acknowledging, we can access it more. But it's all, I mean, as soon as I say some of these things, I think about all the places where, I think about all the situations where it might not be true, so it's none of this also should be fixed, right? Like, meaning, for example, this thing about agency in so many situations and contexts that I've worked in, which are post-conflict or very marginalized communities that have experienced oppression over many, many years, right? Like, when you think about that and you think about agency in those situations, you have to have a different conversation about agency then, right? Like, because there has been political there's been political oppression, there has been oppression by state, by very powerful systems, right? Like, so then the conversation about agency looks different. And there, I'm not saying there's no agency or there's no agency to make choices there, but we must also acknowledge what that kind of oppression, what influence it has on the access to agency in my life.
Makes sense. I mean, it makes sense for you to say that because you are a therapist. Because I mean, like, you probably have like so many clients and who have different stories and have been to different situations. So
yeah. So I think it's important to, if there's a particular thing that I'm saying, or a way in which I'm describing something that doesn't resonate, right? Like, I think most people should trust themselves, because it doesn't have to resonate with everyone. Yeah.
I think that defeats the entire purpose of narrative practices again.
Yeah, if you make it then that's the dominant discourse, right? Like,
right. Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah.
I was about to ask you something. I lost my train of thought. But I was again coming back to the values and how we are sort of made to make decisions based on what the society expects us to. I think starting with the questions that you referred to earlier is a very good start, because then you'll understand if you're actually doing what you want to do or just because the society wants you to do a certain thing. So, like, what are the kind of questions that you think one can ask themselves to begin that journey? I think one of the questions that you discussed earlier was, why are the things that I'm doing important to me?
Yeah.
Are there any similar questions that we can ask ourselves?
So another question that we might ask ourselves is, say, if we are thinking that something is not okay with me, right? Like, you either are a witness to something, or you experience something and you feel that's not okay, to treat someone else this way, or to treat me this way, or whatever. If you're experiencing this feeling of, okay, it's not okay, then you could ask yourself, what is feeling transgressed for me? That is, transgressed meaning not respected, right? Like, what is being disrespected here? That and that could also uncover something that's important to you, right? Like, it could be that, oh, I want all beings to be treated equally, right? Like, something like that. Or I think it's not okay to be physically aggressive with someone, like, yeah. And then from that also you can uncover things that are important for you. Yeah.
So, follow the strong feelings that you feel.
Yeah, pay attention to them, I think, and asking ourselves with curiosity, right? Like, with a generous curiosity about, why might this be upsetting me so much? Like, what is feeling not okay about this, and is it coming in the way of, is it because something is coming in the way of how I would prefer to be? Yeah.
Therapy actually is a lot of work, no?
Yeah.
No, I mean, some of my friends ask me, like, do you get all your answers from therapy?
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, I just get questions.
Yeah.
So, I mean, what I'm trying to get at is, I think there's also this misconception that once you start going to therapy, life is just gonna be perfect. It's just gonna, work out well. But I think what we tend to forget is that therapy is a beginning of a journey, and that it's supposed to go, long term. So I think that is one of the misconceptions. So maybe now we can move to your areas of specialty, because you cater to children with disability. So maybe we can go to that domain. But before we start, I just wanted to ask, what is the preferred term? Because there's this one event I went to. So it was an HR event. So they were kind of encouraging recruiters to recruit differently abled people or disabled people. And in the middle of the conference, there's this one guy who stood up and he just said, like, this entire conference is leading to nowhere, because the words that you guys are using is wrong. It's not disabled people, but it's differently abled people. So which one is correct? Because I saw a lot of confused faces there.
Yeah. So I think that, the first thing I would say is, if a person with a disability is saying, I would prefer to be referred to as differently abled, then that there is no, arguing, or if they say, I want to be referred to as a disabled person, then, that is their preferred way of referring to the conditions they experience themselves, right? So I would respect that. I think the idea of disability for me, and the understanding of disability that I stand by, let's say, is that we are, one is disabled, a person is disabled by the environment not being accessible to my particular ways of being, right? Like, so a person is disabled by the fact that there is no ramp and only stairs, not by the fact that they are wheelchair users, right? A person is disabled by the fact that a video or something doesn't have captions, not by the fact that they are deaf, right? Like, but for, or by the fact that documents are not accessible in braille, or are not tactile ways accessible, is what makes somebody disabled, right? Like, not the fact that they are blind, for example. So in that sense, the understanding of disability that I stand by, or I'm influenced by, is the idea that we are disabled by environments that are not accessible to our different ways of being, right? And I think, so then the word disability is not about putting that inside in the person, no? It is that you're saying, I'm disabled by the environment.
Right.
So I'm a person with disability, right? Like, so some, like in international disability communities of self-advocates, many people now choose to use the word either person with disability or even disabled person, for example. And some people might still prefer to use differently abled, and I think it's respecting what a person with disability wants. I would think person with disability is kind of like a term that we can use, and hopefully without it hurting anybody, you know? Yeah.
So in your experience of dealing with disabled people, what has your experience been like? Because I think you're specialized in mental health and also people with disability.
Yeah.
So how is it different for people with disability?
I mean, so earlier we were talking about like systems of power and of how we should be that influence how the kind of distress we may experience, right? Like, and ableism, which is this idea that bodies, minds, our ways of being have to be in these particular normative ways, and otherwise there is something wrong, right? Like, that is the dominant, that is also one system of power or a dominant discourse, ableism. So people with disabilities then are constantly confronted with the ableist ideas or in our society, right? Like, an ableist ways of being that they must try to conform to, you know. So I think that, and because it is something that we don't talk about a lot, or at all, right? Like, it feels like it's almost like that system of power, ableism, is more invisibilized because we don't talk about it much. I mean, many systems of power are invisibilized: heteronormativity, patriarchy, even though we talk about it so much, like uh, so I feel that part of the work when we are doing mental health work with people with disabilities is to be able to understand that, right? Like that there are very strong ableist forces in the world around us that demand that we conform to certain ways of being, yeah, and that can cause a lot of distress, because I can try as somebody with a disability would try constantly then to conform to those norms, and that can cause a lot of distress, because then you end up feeling like you're not good enough all the time, right? Like so I think bringing some of this attention to the systems of power that demand certain ways of being, and what are their preferred ways of being, then what are the ways in which they would like to engage with the world, and also to place the problem in the systems of power, right?
And
like
not in themselves.
Exactly. Like I was saying earlier, to place the problem in the fact that this document or this building or this thing is not accessible to me because it has not been made accessible. It's not because of something in me that I am not able to access it, right? Like, so yeah, I think that, and that can be an important thing to just to understand for ourselves when it's a person who experiences a disability, So I don't know if there is a difference particularly between people with disabilities and people who don't experience disabilities. I think that this thing of ableism we must bring attention to when we are talking about and interacting with people with disabilities, right? Like talking to in a therapeutic context, it's very important for therapists who work with persons with disabilities to take into account ableism as a system of power and dominant discourse in the work that we do. Yeah.
Right. That makes sense. You were constantly using the word ableism and ableist. Just for the benefit of our listeners, do you want to a little bit explain it?
And maybe what we could do is I could share with you a little definition. You can put it in some sort of description or something like that. That would be. I wish I could read it like a definition now, but basically, ableism is this idea that there is in body and mind there are certain ways of being that are considered to be the way to be, right? Like and bodies should look like this, minds should function in this way, and if it's not like that, then it is something is wrong, right? Like the discourse or the system of power that says that is what we call ableism. So according to ableism, certain people's bodies and minds function the way they must, and other people's don't function the way they must, right? But which is not true. There is diversity in the human experience and the way in which human bodies are and human minds are and function. There is diversity in that. And that diversity must be taken into account when we think about anything that we build a society around.
Right.
When we build buildings, when we think about schools, when we think about how we teach, when we think about social relationships, all of this, that diversity of being human must be taken into account when we think about it, right? Like, yeah.
Makes sense. So, whenever we talk about mental health, it's I think it's a popular popular narrative that it stems down to childhood.
Right.
So, how does childhood play a role in having a stable mental health or like being mental illness free, if you may?
So I suppose there are lots of theories that talk about how our childhood experiences influence like our like mental health maybe as adults. And I think you know childhood experiences are important, and they do influence also what becomes important to us, right? Like not only the things that we might find difficult in life, but also the skills that we have learned, the ways in which we respond to certain things, the values that become important to us. Even those could be connected back to uh, childhood, but in some ways to me it also feels like it is we could do that with any part of our life, not only childhood. Like, when I'm much older, I could think about my 20s in that way, and the things that happened in my 20s and how they have influenced, how I am now. But that, so, that could happen. I just think that, yes, we respond to the experiences that happen in our lives, and those responses to the experiences of our lives do influence what values may become important to us, what skills we may build, the ways in which we respond to the world, and the ways in which we are in relationship with the world. They do. So that's kind of like the short answer. It does, yes, influence, right? Like,
but so does your teenage or like your early 20s.
Yeah, and if you have a difficult experience in your teens or your 20s, that is also going to have a big influence,
right,
on your life, right? Like, but I think sometimes we think about only the quote unquote negative consequences that those experiences, I mean, not to say that there are positive consequences, right? But what I'm saying is that in the ways in which we respond to that, we also something becomes important to us. For example, if I was experienced bullying in school, and if I was teased a lot or something like that, it might become important to me as an adult or as a teenager for everybody to be treated equally, right? Like, in that sense, I mean, not that there are positive consequences of having difficult experiences.
Yeah. So in that way, do you think like disability and mental health have any relation with each other?
In the sense, like,
I mean, does disability, does having disability affect your mental health in certain ways? And
I mean, yeah, in a sense, not because I have a disability, it is affecting my mental health, but I think in the fact that when I'm not my ways of being, or the ways in which my body might look and how I might access information in the world, when it doesn't fit with how the world is made, for example, right? Like, that will have an influence on my mental health, right? For example, if places are not accessible to me,
right,
if information online or in documents is not accessible to me, and if I'm always confronted with that lack of access, that is going to have an effect on my mental health. Sometimes simply because I cannot access the things that other people can access in order to
right,
feel good about themselves, and sometimes because I'm always confronted with the disability, and because the environment is not accessible. But it can also lead to me thinking that I just can't I mean, it's about me, right? Like, that I'm not good enough somehow, or so, I think in that sense it can have an influence of
right,
on mental health. It does have an influence on mental health, and it's something that we don't talk about a lot, right?
yeah,
Like, we might talk about like skill building for people with disabilities, but the distress of uh, being a person with a disability in a world that is largely ableist, that is not often spoken about,
Right.
you know. And I think it's important to bring attention to that.
Yeah, that's true. So, like, as guardians or parents or adults, teachers, what do you think people can do to, accommodate people with disability? Like, what are the things that, we should be doing?
I mean, there's a disability activist who I really like. Her name is Mia Mingus. And she says access is love, and I love that line, because it's with building an accessible society that a lot of this we can try to make it more and more and more accessible, right? Like, that is one thing, but that is also it's very systemic, right? Like, to make a building accessible, to make a school accessible, it takes like systemic changes to happen. I think as individuals, I would say this narrative idea that we were talking about, right? Like, people are experts of their own lives and people have agency. I think those ideas also are for people with disabilities, right? Like, and that they can choose what is okay and not okay for them, what they like, what they don't like, and they have agency in their lives. And to think about I think that idea of like, everybody has agency and has expertise on how to navigate their own life.
Yeah.
Like,
So
everyone,
basically,
people with disabilities also, have that expertise.
do not undermine them
Yeah.
and trusting them when they say something.
Yeah. And not assuming,
Yeah. Makes sense.
what they can or cannot do and things like that, right? Like, yeah.
Let's move a little bit on women and mental health, if that's okay with you.
Sure.
I mean, in your, like, you probably have like a lot of clients, right? So what is the ratio of male versus female?
I don't know if this should be considered in any way like the norm, but for me, it's more women, gender non-conforming folks, or
Right.
people who are identify as non-binary, right?
Okay.
Like, more that I would say. But with when I think about working with younger people, when I was working at a school, for example, there wasn't that much of a difference,
Okay.
in terms of whether boys came more or girls came more, or it was more non-binary young people. So I think with adults accessing like a private practice, it does feel like it's more, I mean, for me, it's more women who reach out. But there are all, yeah. I think one of the things I wanted to say when I was saying that is also, again, this discourse of masculinity and the idea of accessing therapy, right?
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
and what might that discourse of masculinity be telling men and boys about accessing therapy?
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah,
or talking about their feelings or whatever therapy is perceived as, no?
Yeah, that's also what I was trying to get at, because
Yeah.
I think there are more women and gender non-conforming people reaching out to therapy more than men, and I just like wanted to talk about the same thing, how our idea of masculinity might be the reason why men are more hesitant to reach out for help. So yeah, that is actually what I was getting at.
Yeah.
So I think you also mentioned about how our lives are multi-storied before also. So I just wanted to understand that even more, like, for our listeners and viewers, of course, like, what does that mean? And how does that help us in, having a better mental health?
You know how sometimes when we are talking about the anxiety that we may experience, or we are experiencing depression, we may say things like, or people may say things like, oh, this language is used where I'm an anxious person, I'm a depressed person, right? Like, And not that that's not okay to say or anything, but like that, it's almost like that is the one identity, right? Like, or the one story about my life that we are talking about, but that there are also many other stories about my life, right? Like, for example, I might experience anxiety, but I also something completely different. Like, I might love plants, or I love animals, um, or I love going on hikes, or so there are so many other stories about me, or for example, there may be stories like I'm an underconfident person, but there may be stories, there may be cracks in that story itself. There may be, if I inquire into it, I might find that there are moments when you can speak, and or you can interact or do whatever that thing is that you want to do in a way that might not fit into the description of an underconfident person in your own idea, right? Like, I might discover that there are stories about me that don't fit with that identity, right? So in that sense, we have many stories about our lives, and not one story defines my entire life or way of being or way in which I show up in the world, and that to think that today I'm experiencing distress because I have to do something that I find difficult, for example. But there may be, but that is not the only story about me, that doesn't have to become the dominant story about my life,
right?
That there are, and I think uncovering or making more visible those multiple stories of our lives,
Right.
it also helps us to not make that one sometimes problem stories like the dominant story about me, and we think about when we are talking about this in the narrative practices, we use this metaphor of the starry sky, right? Like, and there are many stars in the sky, and the stars are stories, and our lives are like that.
Okay.
We have as many stories in our lives as the stars in the sky. And at different moments, we might connect different stars to make a constellation, and it looks like, a dog or whatever, something, right? Like, and if you connect different stars, it might look different,
Right.
I hope that metaphor helped.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like relate to this, but how I understood and the term I used was different.
Yeah.
Like in my therapy journey, so
Right.
my therapist would call it messages. So I would go to my therapist and just like rant to him about, I'm so indecisive. I'm like, like I can't do this, I can't do that. I'm so, I would like label myself something. And then he would just ask me like, where did you get that message from? And I think this is something I've mentioned in my podcast before also. But like, it talked about how we associate ourselves and our stories with one particular label, and we just assume that our entire life is, that same label. And then you talked about having cracks in those stories, right?
Yeah.
So there's this one time I think I was working on this project, and it didn't go very well. So, and I was just like blaming it on my inconsistency. And I told my therapist that, that I feel like I'm very inconsistent and stuff. And then he just like stopped me, and he like, told me, but this is our 45th session. Like, you can't say that you're inconsistent because you've been coming to therapy for so long. So I think that was like the exact thing that you're trying to tell
The
me.
crack in the story.
The crack in the story.
One of the
So
cracks.
like that kind of made me reconsider the narrative and the stories that I was telling myself, So I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I think it's is it a human tendency of doing it, or I don't know, because
I don't know either, actually, like, but I guess this thing of labels and all of that does kind of do that, right? Like, yeah.
I think also like when you put a label, you feel like it's there forever.
Yeah, exactly.
Like that it cannot change.
Yeah.
That's also probably why.
Yeah.
But to have to like, get introduced to this idea and this concept is kind of eye-opening. in some ways, and something
I'm
that's
glad.
helped me.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. And also, I think something that you've used is like imperfect solidarities.
Right. Where was that? Anyway. Um, yeah, what were you going
Yeah,
to ask about that?
imperfect solidarities through group conversations.
Mm,
So, like,
mm.
what do you mean by that? Because that
So,
felt like a jargon and like something, you know?
yeah. So it's a I don't know, like a series of conversations, group conversations that I did with a dear friend and co-conspirator, I suppose, in Kathmandu. Her name is Nayantara, who is one of the co-founders of this organization called Photo Circle and Photo Kathmandu, and we are friends. Mainly that's how we started having this conversation. And we were talking about solidarity building as movements, right? Like, for example, the feminist movement, the anti-caste movement, the environmental conservation movement, whatever these movements are that try to influence policies, that try to influence societies into more being more socially just, right? Like, anyway, we were talking about solidarity building that happens collectively in those movements, and how we all stand together when there is something that we want to change or we want to call attention to, like going to protests or creating, wanting to have an influence on all that, right? Like, so I think it was a series of explorations that where we had groups of people, we invited groups of people, and we would have conversations about basically solidarity building, the things that support solidarity building, the things that might sometimes come in the way of it, and this idea that solidarities are imperfect, that that it might not, with that demanding, and I might not show up in the perfect, most politically perfect way in all those movements at all the times, right? Like that it's also a journey, and that we are and that there are imperfections in that journey of building solidarities, and and that when we and just so it was a way of kind of acknowledging that imperfections or imperfectness of solidarity building, but also for us to be able to have conversations where I might not always agree with the other person, but we might also have have common values or goals that we want a socially just society, for example, but there may be some things in which we don't agree with each other, right? Like, so it was having conversations around all this, and it was 11 explorations that we did. It was approximately
on different
once a month,
solidarities,
different themes.
Okay.
Like we did one on like some of the movements that had happened, or some of the activism that had happened around sexual violence in Nepal, around environmental conservation.
right?
But we also spoke about themes that come up maybe in these sorts of conversations. For example, we spoke about shame, and how shame might influence how we show up in different spaces. Or we also spoke about apology. We had one exploration on hope. So we thought about all the different things that, not all the different things, many different things that we can think about in the solidarity building process.
Right.
And we had conversations around all of this. It was actually really a big learning experience for us too. I mean, I'm speaking for her, but we've spoken about it a lot, like for me too. And also thinking about how the mental health, at least the private therapy practice or the one-on-one therapy practice, is an individual thing, right? but I also believe that it is about these systems of power, right? So this was also in some ways a way for me to have conversations about the systems of power, not only in the therapy room, in a room with more people, larger audience, kind of, yeah.
Right. I mean, but like imperfect solidarities are better than no solidarities at all, right?
Exactly. Yes.
So I think I get your point.
Yeah.
Also, like one thing I wanted to ask in the beginning, which I think I forgot, was is related to your journey. So like you were based in Hyderabad and then you decided to move to Nepal.
Yeah.
So what was the story behind that? Because I mean, I think by now most of our, all of our listeners and viewers can notice the fact that we're just speaking in English here.
Yeah.
I mean, you do know how to speak in Nepali, but
I
like
do,
your
yeah,
preferred language was English. So,
Yeah.
so what was your transition from Nepal to India like? In why did you choose to come to Nepal?
So I guess I should say the first step that led me to coming to Nepal was not entire. It's not like I was thinking I wanted to come to Nepal in particular, right? Like I also had this thing of I wanted to work in places other than India a little bit. So it was I started working for an organization here that was looking for a mental health person to work with. It's an organization, it's a French organization that worked with children, young people who were living on the street and their families. And I think then I came and then I did this work and I really just liked my life here. I liked living here, and so I've been back and forth a little bit, but now I've been here from 2014 more or less continuously. So later on it became like a choice that I made. I think in the beginning it was something that happened to happen, and then
and then you enjoyed Nepal.
Yeah.
So I think it's also because you've also been here because of narrative practices, because you've been doing some diploma courses and workshops here, right?
Yeah. I mean, I guess it's more the other way around, in the sense that I started doing the narrative practices stuff here because I was here and I wanted to do that here.
Okay.
Yeah, it's more that because Nepal came into my life officially before narrative practices.
Okay. Right. Yeah. I mean, when you started, there are probably not many people who followed narrative practices, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So it made sense for you to like stay here and popularize that idea.
Yeah.
So, I think this kind of brings us towards the end of today's episode. It was very insightful. I had a lot of epiphanies while I was talking to you.
Right.
And I think this is a good start to our Destigmatizing Mental Health series. So thank you so much for taking your time out, because I know you're like in a rush and you're, like I think you're going back to India in a few days.
Right.
So thank you so much for taking some time out. Would you want to say something at the end for our viewers, listeners?
No, I'm not very good with one-liners, I guess. But it was lovely to have this conversation, and that's about it. I hope it's useful. And if there are any questions, or like if people ask something or are, I'm happy to.
Yes. Can you also
respond.
mention where they can reach out to you if they want help professionally, or just want to access your work and all of that? Where can they reach out to you?
So at the moment, I'm only doing private consultations with children and young people. And my profile and my contact details are available online. I mean, on two mainly websites. One is Nepal Mental Health, and the other is this place called Yoma.
We will link them below in the description box. Yes.
So if people want to reach out, they can.
Thank you so much, Prathama. It was lovely having you here. Thank you so much for taking some time out. And I think that's it for today's episode. See you guys in the next one. Bye.